Hey everybody, my name is Odell Horn. I'm the president of the North Georgia Conference United Methodist Men, and I want to welcome you to this weekly video update for Friday, June 24th, 2022. This will be my last weekly update as president of the North Georgia Conference United Methodist Men. Starting on July 1st, Ernest Perry will take over as the conference president of the United Methodist Men so that I can write this little doctoral dissertation. So much fun. Today, I want to talk to you about Jubilee. I want to first, before I get into Jubilee, I want to thank the United Methodist Men for those last 2 years of joining us virtually, primarily because of the pandemic that was caused by not Omicron. What's the name of the pandemic? I forgot the name of the pandemic, but you know what it is. And so we've been online for the last 2 years primarily, and we've done a lot of things with professors talking about the Trinity, professors talking about Christianity in Africa, professors talking about John Wesley and Charles Wesley and their contributions to Christianity. And then we got into professors talking about Asia's contributions to Christianity, as well as North America and European. And so we just tried to educate you and bring you a little bit closer online because we couldn't meet for the most part over the last 2 years in person. Before I really get into Jubilee, I do want to apologize. I did make a video about Annual Conference 2022, and I've stated that the churches, the 70 churches that disaffiliated from the North Georgia Conference at this particular time could not join the Global Methodist Church because the Global Methodist Church wasn't ready to receive churches at that time. And then I received a call from my connection in the Wesleyan Covenant Association, and they said, no, the Global Methodist Church is willing and ready to receive churches that disaffiliate from the North Georgia Conference or from any conference. So I want to make sure that I corrected that. Second, we have a need, and I've expressed this in email, I've expressed this through our mailing list, and I want to make sure that this is still before you. Warren Chapel, United Methodist Church in Commerce, Georgia, has had a problem with a leak in their roof, and this has been going on for months. And so they have a contractor, but they don't have all the funds to fix the leak. And so I'm asking the United Methodist Men to help contribute to the repairing the fellowship hall, which is where the Warren Chapel UMC in Commerce, Georgia, they have a food pantry, and they do it in the fellowship hall. And so they need some help with raising monies to pay the contractor to get this roof leak repaired. And so I'm calling on United Methodist Men to help with this need that we have. And I want to thank the men at Loganville United Methodist Church for keeping this in the forefront of mind. Okay. Next, I have an article that I've written that will be published by United Methodist News Service. It's a presidential address that I did at the annual business meeting for United Methodist Men. And I actually think I might actually post that and then on the website for the North Georgia Conference United Methodist Men, and then send an edited version. We'll see what United Methodist News Service wants to do. But I really do want to encourage you as we begin to get together and to meet together again, that we're still keeping ministry as our focus and ministry to the next generation as our focus. And so I want to thank, there's several people I want to thank. First, I want to thank Peachtree Road United Methodist Church and Hickory Flat United Methodist Men, both for taking the challenge of radical mentoring and moving forward with that. And I want to encourage all United Methodist Men to explore radical mentoring so that we can begin mentoring and discipling the next generation of United Methodist Men. Second, I also want to thank Alpharetta First UMC as well as St. James UMC, which is literally down the street and around the corner from Alpharetta First, for getting together and starting what is now known as Bridging the Gap Men's Fellowship. The summer of 2000, there was a lot of protest, and some of those protests turned violent. And then there was a knee-jerk reaction that I call with the attack on critical race theory. And the men at Alpharetta First, which is a white church, and the men at St. James, which is a black church, got together for Bible study and prayer. And that was only supposed to last for 4 weeks. Well, here it is 2 years later. And Bridging the Gap Men's Fellowship is ready to spread across the North Georgia Conference. So please reach out to Bridging the Gap if you want to know more about this ministry of reconciliation that the Apostle Paul talked about in Second Corinthians chapter 5. That we're not talking past each other on cable news, but we're sitting down at the table of brotherhood and we're talking to each other. And so the goal of Bridging the Gap, and this has been bottom up, this has not been something that I've introduced an executive committee and we were going to push this through to the United Methodist Men. This has been something that the men and two local churches got together, and then a third church, Mount Pisgah UMC, joined them later. And this model is, they're ready to spread this model, and other churches at annual conference have come up to me and asked me about this model, Bridging the Gap. And this is the ministry of reconciliation that we want to promote in the North Georgia Conference, United Methodist Men, which leads me to the topic of this particular video, which is Jubilee. In Luke chapter 4, verses 14, the scripture says, Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and the news about him spread through the whole countryside. When he was teaching in the synagogue, he was teaching in the synagogue and everyone praised him. He went to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day, he went into the synagogue, and as was his custom, he stood up and to read. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." That is known as Jubilee, which is a concept that is in the book of Isaiah, but also in the concept in the book of Leviticus. And so I want to talk to you about Jubilee, because we just had this second celebration of Juneteenth as a federal holiday. And Juneteenth, I learned when I first went to school in Texas College in the 1990s, that this is the day in which the last slaves in America, which were in Galveston on June 19th, heard the word that President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. But they didn't hear this word until June 19th, 1865. And it's called Juneteenth because it wasn't just Galveston on June 19th. There were other cities in Texas and Louisiana. So between June 13th and June 19th, Union soldiers went through Louisiana and Texas proclaiming that the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed, and therefore the slaves had been set free, and they'd been set free almost 2.5 years earlier. All right, so that's just a little bit about the origin of, at least according to what I was taught in African American studies, the origin of the term Juneteenth. But it's also called Jubilee Day, and that's what I want to talk to you about. Also, one last thing. Juneteenth was a state holiday in Texas when I got there in the 1990s. But we never celebrated Juneteenth. I'm from Rochester, New York. We never celebrated Juneteenth in Rochester, New York. And that's because slavery ended in New York State in 1827. That's right. You heard it here. Slavery ended in New York State in 1827. I know. You didn't learn that in school. And some of you are saying, what? Some of you may be scratching your heads. Yeah, slavery began in the colony of New Amsterdam, which is modern-day Manhattan, in 1626. And there was a slave market, or a Congo market, as they were known at the time, on Wall Street. Right. Wall Street had a slave market, literally down the block from the New York Stock Exchange. And New York had a very important role to play in slavery. I want to make sure that I don't misinform you on this, because the sale of cotton, which is what primarily drove slavery, as well as the sale of tobacco, those cotton products and cotton was brought to the market. Well, there was no slave plantation franchises. So most slave plantations in the South, in Atlanta and Savannah and Augusta, it was just an individual slave owner who owned a plantation, and he could have anywhere from a handful of slaves to hundreds of slaves. but they didn't own generally more than one plantation. They owned only one plantation, and they would sell their cotton to the marketplace. And New York made money. Wall Street made money off of the sale of cotton. According to statistics in African American studies, upwards to 40% of the sale of cotton was made by investors on Wall Street. Yeah, yeah. And in addition, slave plantations in the South, as well as in the North, because there are plantations. The state of Rhode Island, the official name in 2022 is the state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, because there's plantations in Providence. Yeah, you didn't know that. We're talking about Jubilee, but we got to set the historical record straight. The slavery existed north of the Mason-Dixon line in New York, in Massachusetts, in Pennsylvania, in New Jersey, in Rhode Island, and I don't. Oh, I forgot California, Chicago, in the Twin Cities, in Minnesota. Slavery was not just a Southern problem, slavery was also a Northern problem. And Northern liberals made sure that they swept this history under the rug. And it took Ruth Simmons, who was the president of Brown University, to address slavery in the Ivy Leagues, because Harvard University was built by slaves, Yale University was built by slaves, and Princeton University was built by slaves. And they didn't go get slaves from Atlanta and Savannah. No, they went down the street and around the corner to get slaves in Boston, in Princeton, as well as in New Haven. Yeah, yeah. I'll post a link for it. There's been so much research done on slavery in the North, and so I'll post that link to you. Also, when there were slave revolts, the plantations in both the North and the South, they were insured by the companies in Hartford, Connecticut, and Providence, Rhode Island. That's why when people like Randall Robinson, they filed a reparations lawsuit, they filed it against like Aetna and Bank of New York. They filed it against all, and AIG. They filed it against all Northern companies. They didn't file a reparations lawsuit against Southern plantation owners or descendants of Southern plantation owners. They filed it against Wall Street firms. All right. So the reason why we didn't celebrate Juneteenth in New York is because slavery ended in 1827, and the New York liberals made sure that they swept that history of slavery in New York under the rug. But there is a marker on Wall Street about the history of the Congo market in New York City. All right, I just want to make sure that you know it's what we call a carefully crafted narrative. Your colleges and universities have been telling you that, and even in your high schools, have been telling you that slavery was a Southern problem. No, 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 no. Slavery was a Northern problem as well. Matter of fact, with slavery in California, and California didn't join that union until like 1848 or 1849, something like that. Slavery was a national problem. So when we talk about Jubilee, we got to make sure we have the right context. I apologize. For those of you who did not know, I'm doing a doctorate degree in theology, and I'm a contextual theologian. So I always have to bring in the context. In addition, I have a master's degree in African and African American studies from Clark Atlanta University. So I want to make sure that we're telling the right story and the right narrative, and we're not just talking about slavery as a Southern problem. That's wrong. That's a lie. Slavery was a national problem. So we want to beware of these carefully crafted narratives. All right, because this plays out in the North with segregation in the 20th century. So when we're talking, Jesus is coming in the synagogue and he's talking about setting the oppressed free. Well, you know, the three strikes, you're outlaw. Nelson Rockefeller, governor of New York, he introduced that. Yeah, stop, question, and frisk. Yeah, that was New York City, right? So we want to make sure Rudy Giuliani introduced that when he was the mayor of New York City. So when we're talking about Jubilee, we want to make sure that we're telling the right story and not just the carefully crafted narrative of people who are trying to hide their sins and accuse other people of sins. Let me quote something in Matthew chapter 7. Judge not lest you be judged. For with the same measure that you measure, it will be measured unto you. All right. So I want to make sure that when we're talking Jubilee, understand that this is about folks in Texas and Galveston hearing that slaves have been set free and that they can enjoy freedom. But we want to make sure that we're telling the correct narrative. Jesus came to set the oppressed free. Jesus came to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And we are in a philosophical battle in the United States over rights and freedoms. And this is only going to get worse, I predict, as the Supreme Court is poised to overturn Roe versus Wade. But this also will bleed into the General Conference of 2024. And I want to caution those of you who are in black churches, I want to caution you not to get involved and pick sides in terms of um, who's right and who's wrong according to what the Democratic Party platform is or what the Republican Party platform is. I want to make sure that we've got our history right. That's number one, because truth be told, after the central jurisdiction of the United Methodist Church was disbanded, all across the country, black churches were sold. And the proceeds of those black churches that were sold were put back into the district fund or to the conference fund. And then black churches were told that they had to go and buy white churches that had been abandoned during white flight in the 1960s and 1970s. And so black churches had to take out mortgages of churches that they and their ancestors did not build and that they could not necessarily afford. So when we're talking about reparations in the United Methodist Church, we need to have a conversation about this forced sale of black churches that happened not only in the South, but also happened in the North. All right. So I want to make sure that we're not having conversations based upon the Republican Party's platform or the Democratic Party's platform, that we're having conversation based upon history, and that history is accurately told, and it's not a history of Southern white Christian Republicans are racist, because as someone who's a son of the North, Northern white liberals are also racist, which is why Robin DiAngelo wrote a book called Nice Racism: How Progressive White People Perpetuate Racial Harm. You might need to read that. I'm just saying. I'll put all my sources in the link because I'm a researcher and that's what I do. I don't just give you op-eds. I give you the sources of the information that I'm portraying to you so that you can be informed. All right. I love you all. These last 2 years have been great. I thank you for the opportunity of you all have given me to serve as president of the North Georgia Conference United Methodist Men, but I want you to be informed. I do not want you to be misled. Lastly, I want to say this. In September of 2015, the African bishops sent a letter to the United Methodist Church. And that letter stated that they are supporting Scripture, they are against same-sex marriage, and that their struggles are as with terrorism. I want us to be careful about these carefully crafted narratives that are rooted in American political arguments as we go to General Conference in 2024. We're a global church, and I need the United Methodist Church to mentally make that shift that we're no longer an American church, and that when we go to General Conference 2024, we will not have a conversation that's dominated by American political concerns. And so when we go to General Conference 2024, we're going to have a come to Jesus meeting over what our priorities are when it comes to politics and ministry. And we're not going to do this with American political conversations dominating General Conference in 2024. All right. That's what I have for you. Jesus came to set the captives free. And so let's be men who don't oppress. Let's be men who set captives free, proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, and proclaim Jubilee. All right. Thank you. My name is Oda Horn. It's been a pleasure to serve as your president for the last 2 years. Peace and God bless.